Okay, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Paul Salim. I'm the president of the Middle East Institute. I'm in Washington, D.C. I'm thrilled to have a distinguished panel of friends and experts on the conditions of Lebanon. We are here to really reflect on the acute crises on the economic level, socio-political level, and also in the sector of education and higher education that Lebanon is passing through. This is the most acute crisis of this kind in Lebanon's modern history, and we're still in the middle of it or the beginning of it, and the consequences are really, really grave. I'm hoping today to look for rays of hope, to look for paths forward, to look for scenarios where the country can move in a positive direction from the deep hole it is in now. Let me quickly introduce my guests. Their full bios are on our website, so I'll be brief. I'm thrilled to have with us Dr. Fadlu Khouri. Dr. Khouri is the president of the American University of Beirut, my alma mater. Partly I was there for a couple of years, and many others I know probably on this call. The AUB, the doyen of private universities in Lebanon, and going through a very difficult period. Dr. Khouri assumed the presidency in 2015. Before that, he had a very distinguished medical career at Emory University School of Medicine, where he was a leader in that institution and a lead professor and researcher in oncology at the Cancer Institute. Fadlo, it's great to have you with us today. Also with us is my good friend Maha Yahya. Dr. Yahya is the director of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, where I served for a number of years, and doing amazing work at a very difficult time for Lebanon, and I would say for the region. She follows the Lebanese situation at all levels very, very closely. Prior to joining Carnegie, she had a great career at ESCWA, the UN Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, and also at the UNDP. Maha, thanks for joining us. And also my good friend Diwan. Dr. Diwan is currently in Paris, professor of economics at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. He had a long, excellent career at the World Bank, both as a sort of a thinker and researcher, but also as country director for Ethiopia and Sudan, Ghana, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Burkina Faso and Guinea, West Bank. Extensive knowledge of economics of the region, and as a Lebanese, deeply steeped in what's going on today there. He's also taught at Harvard and NYU, and now in Paris. So thank you all for joining us. To our audience, thanks for joining us as well, whether you're on Zoom or joining us on the live stream on YouTube. If you're on Zoom, you can submit your question through the Q&A feature on Zoom, and I will keep my eye on that and try to throw in your questions during this conversation. If you're following on live stream or on YouTube, send your questions by email to events@mei.edu. Okay, then, let's get started. And Sha, let me start with you. This may be the deepest part of the current crisis is the economic part of it, and the economic part of it is partly the economy itself, but a lot of it is the macro finances, the banking sector, the central bank, and its effect on the national currency, and a whole complex set of economic conditions, which are now, with the dramatic decline of the value of the pound, are causing tremendous social pain, high levels of poverty and unemployment that Lebanon hasn't seen maybe since World War I, if one wants to be, look at it historically. And I know you've been writing a lot and analyzing a lot, and I don't want to sort of do that too much now. I want to try to look forward, and I know you've been doing that as well, maybe at two levels. One is the scenario or scenarios. Where are we headed in the next 6 months? And then the corollary question is, what needs to be done in order to make the next 6 months, 12 months, 5 years better than they otherwise might be? You're on mute, so when you're ready to go, there we go.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for the invite, and I'm great to be with Maha and Fadlo on this panel. I will tell you about economic scenarios, but just as an economist talking to a political scientist, let me just start by saying that economic reforms are needed, and we know what they are, but the key is that they're not being implemented. So it makes, at least in my economist mind, the main question really political. Why the lack of action? And the problem is endemic. I mean, the crisis was inevitable since at least 2016. We saw this house of cards ready to collapse, this Ponzi scheme, if not earlier. But no corrective action was taken by successive governments, in spite of repeated appeals by many, including by the international community, to help Lebanon if Lebanon adjusted. So back to the economics. The crisis really started 9 months ago. I'm not going to get into its genesis. There was a sudden capital flow leading to a rare triple crisis where the government and the banks were bankrupt and the external accounts were very much imbalanced. So Lebanon fell from very high to very low in one shock, big shock. And 9 months into the crisis, 6 months into the current Diab government, really not a single policy action has been undertaken. That really must be stressed. The most basic response should have been, and still is, to start by stabilizing the situation. Impose capital control, so we start the hemorrhage, start reducing the source of the problem, less government deficits, less corruption, fixing at least electricity, which is a big cash cow, devaluating the currency. None of this has happened so far. Now, to get the economy going, in addition to stabilizing it, require also a debt reduction to make the state creditworthy again, and to restructure the banking sector so that it can work again. It's now completely frozen. So this in turn does require a distribution of losses. These losses are immense. They are about 3 times GDP. And that needs to be done in a socially acceptable manner, which means really hitting mostly bank owners and large depositors. The debts are mostly internal. That's one specificity of Lebanon. The lack of action has now put us in a different situation, one of hyperinflation. The government is surviving, buying time, basically by rationing the little external reserve that they still have to import basic necessities, and it's printing money to pay for its expenditure and to allow for some limited bank withdrawals. Now, these injections of cash are chasing very limited supply of foreign exchange, leading to hyperinflation. The Lebanese pound, as you know, has lost 80% of its value in 9 months, and it's now accelerating. So from a cardiac arrest, we are now moving into a septic shock. The only way to stop this collapse right now, before engaging in deep structural reform, is unfortunately to put the economy basically in a coma. Starving it of cash until credible reforms bring back confidence. Unfortunately, we're nowhere there. After an ambitious plan was announced in March, banks and politicians have counterattacked with proposals to basically shift the burden of adjustment on the population. So instead of a bail-in of banks that we're talking about, that the government's been talking about, a bailout using state assets, basically. And negotiations with the IMF have completely stalled. So we're in a very disruptive phase right now, with the extra shock from COVID and the political crisis. Maha will talk about that. Most firms probably have had to close. It's very hard to keep up with indicators because the situation is so dynamic. But unemployment seems right now close to 40%, poverty probably 50%. There is an exodus already of skills and people leaving since the airport reopened a few days ago. And this will hurt the eventual recovery in the future. And so the question remains, why this irresponsible action? I hope that we will be able later to discuss that. Why this huge social pain really a historical collapse unseen since probably the famine of World War I in Lebanon.
Let me ask you, I mean, the only thing that, I mean, the main thing that has happened is the devaluation. Of course, it's not managed, it's not planned, but I would almost say that the political class, has taken that option and not done much to stop it. We did have a massive devaluation in the 80s when the pound started at around £3 and ended up, at around 2000, £3 to the dollar, ended up in 2000 to the dollar. And I know the two crises are very different, but my question today is, given that the ruling class has, I would say, opted for a free fall of the currency, which makes the, the people pay a big part of this debt. What effects, we know what the horrific social effects and humanitarian effects are. What economic effects, in other words, after this massive devaluation, a government, let's say, taking charge in early 2021, will the fiscal economic situation be different because it's already been devalued?
Right. I mean, just to say that officially, the pound has not been devalued. So officially, it's still at the old rate. And so there's a whole bunch of commodities which are imported at the old rate. This is creating extreme imbalances and ways for that advantage corruption and arbitrage and the like. It also allows some people to get access at cheap dollars. But as you said, de facto, in the market, there's an enormous devaluation. We could say it's happening because nothing is being adjusted, but if you want to be Machiavellic, maybe this is what is meant to happen. And this will wipe out. Now, most deposits are officially in dollars. We call them dollars because there's no real dollars against them. And so they are not yet devalued, if you like. But to withdraw money from banks involves transferring them at the official rate into Lebanese pounds, meaning at 8 times less than the market rate. So effectively, the burden of the adjustment is de facto being pushed on depositors. This would create a huge amount of wealth destruction, and which would reduce the ability of the economy to recover for a long time. And also, it's a solution to the crisis, a way of absorbing the losses that is inefficient and totally unjust, because the poor with $3,000 to $5,000 in the bank, the retiree with their savings in the bank will pay as much as the billionaire that has benefited from corruption and from very high interest rates in the past. So that is de facto what is happening. We call it the lirification scenario, and many of us have warned against this scenario a long time ago. I hope that didn't give the government ideas.
Thank you, Dr. Yahya. Let me turn to you and ask you also a two-level question. One is there was a large uprising in October of last year at the beginning of this economic crisis. It continued. Then, the COVID-19 hit, people kind of stayed home for a while. But there's been some, sporadic return to protest. And I know there's been a lot of efforts to organize this movement and so on. And it also gave a lot of Lebanese and a lot of other people hope that maybe there is a social political movement or alternative to this political class that has lived off of the population and the economy for these past decades. So I would like you to tell us where you see the movement. And then the second question is more of the political class process itself. This current Hassan Diab government, maybe it's at the end of its usefulness. Do you think it'll still do any more? Do you see any changes in government? Do you see any seriousness? As Ha was indicating, at the end of the day, all the actions that need to be taken require political will. It's not economic rocket science, it's economic 101. So Maha, the two levels, the movement and the illustrious government.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for having me on this panel. It's great also to be with you, with Isha, and with Fadlo on the same platform. You may be hearing beeping in a short while. The electricity went in my apartment, and I'm now on the backup UPS. So that's just one indication of where things are heading very quickly in this country. In terms of I'll begin with your first question, which is the movement, the movement on the street, or the multiple movements. The movement itself is also in an impasse to the extent that there is political fragmentation. I mean, this movement, let's remember, was a coalition of different people. It was not an organized movement. It's not political parties of the 20th century going down and organizing mass protests with very clear unified agenda. This was a large number of people who went to the street. Well, actually, I mean, there was a tipping point. There was a tipping point with a buildup of grievances in the country for the past at least decade, if not more. Today, these multiple movements, what we're seeing is different groups beginning to organize themselves, either as political parties, nascent political parties. I'm thinking of people like Taqaddum, Lihaqi, and others, or as at least some sort of, to create some sort of framework and organizational structure that allows for broad coalitions between those groups. The problem is that until now, the attempts to create this kind of broad coalition where they would be able to present themselves as a unified front when confronting the current political class, so that you actually have someone sitting across from you around the table. It's been quite problematic. My sense is that more recently, these efforts have been bearing some fruit. There's an initiative that you and I were involved in, which is to put together a charter, and that's how. But there are other initiatives also that are taking place where they're trying to bring these people together, or these groups together, into a unified front. The advantage of this is to unify demands, and I think this would be the forte of these groups. The demands necessarily at this point have to be the formation of a government of independence. It's not about technocrats. It's not about just about people who know their stuff and having the right person. I mean, the bar has been shifted so low that we're just happy if it's somebody who actually knows what they're doing and they're in the right ministry. The idea is, no, you need people who know what they're doing, but who also have some political independence from all the political parties and are able to undertake the kind of reforms needed. That's the first demand. It has to be a government with exceptional powers to be able to implement an economic rescue plan. It has already talked about the urgent measures that need to be done and which are not being done. And unfortunately, what could have been done 6 months ago, with every day we're losing, the chances of recovery are becoming slimmer, and the time for the country to recover is becoming much longer and much. I mean, the hole we're falling into is becoming much deeper. So the second demand would be to bring on board this kind of a government that is able to implement an economic rescue plan, both short but also medium and long term. And here I want to kind of frame a little bit my thinking about Lebanon. I mean, we're looking at a situation where 4 out of the 5 fundamental pillars of this country are gone, or at least have been seriously challenged. The political power sharing model, the legitimacy pillar of Lebanon is in serious crisis today. The myth of Lebanon as a merchant republic is gone, that relies on banking and tourism is no more, it's gone. The middle class that this country relies on, that has been its best export, let's say, is also in serious jeopardy. As Isha was describing this, there's a significant wealth destruction. and people are immigrating. I'm sure Fadlu will talk more about the doctors, the engineers, the writers, the cineasts, the backbone of this country who are now leaving. The fourth pillar, which is freedoms, fundamental. I mean, this is a country that has always been touted as the place where you could say what you want without being penalized. It's the only space, it's basically the lung for the region. We're seeing a closing down of the space. Journalists are being taken into custody without due recourse. So, and then the fifth pillar is security. So far, the security pillar is still standing on its feet, meaning the army and the internal security forces. But when you're an army officer today and your wages have gone from being, I don't know, $800, $1,000, $2,000 a month to being $200 a month, this is just, or $300. It's only a matter of time before this pillar, the stress on it is quite significant. So the question is, where do we go from here? You asked me about the current government. I think that the current government is not in a position, unfortunately, everybody wanted to give it the chance to do something because it was the government we had. But I'm not seeing in 6 months, in the 6 months they've been in power, even though they come out periodically and say they've accomplished everything that was, or almost everything that was in the ministerial declaration, we're not seeing these results. No policy decisions have been made. At least the critical ones that are needed, not just in terms of reform, but to actually help people. It's taken them 6 months to begin distributing some social protection to the Lebanese. They've just put together a massive list of subsidized goods, which is literally throwing good money after bad. It opens doors to nepotism, clientelism, the way the system is being set up. So what I'm seeing is a government that's actually, it's more like business as usual. It's a government that's as politicized as the ones that were before, and where they're still operating in a kind of business as usual model, even though they're doing a lot more meetings, perhaps. There seems to be a lot more energy in that front, on that front than before, but it's not one. And maybe there's more discussions at the strategic level in the ministry, in the Council of Ministers, but I'm not seeing any action. And I don't think any of us are seeing any real action, and I don't think we will see any action. I don't think that the government, in the current context it's in, the makeup of the government as it is capable of moving forward. This leaves civil society organizations with the only tool they have, which is where I started from. The coalitions they're trying to build, they need to present a unified front where they continue pushing forward, and there's definite work happening there. And going back to the street. Going back to the street is going to, unfortunately, with COVID-19, it becomes very difficult. I think they are now looking at ways to perhaps be more creative to voice dissent, but continue to voice dissent and make it clear that this just is not working. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Maha. Very elaborate, somewhat depressing view, but thank you for that. Dr. Khoury, let me turn to you. Lebanon has been known as a regional center for education for over a century. The AUB, which was established 154 years ago now, I think in 1866, was kind of the doyen of private institutions of higher education in Lebanon and in the region, followed in Lebanon by the establishment of the French, the St. Joseph University, then the Lebanese American University, and others, which have really made Lebanon a leader in higher education in the region, and also has created a Lebanese population which is generally very highly educated, very capable. And as you yourself have recently said and warned, higher education is going through its most acute crisis, and AUB, our alma mater, has been going through an existential, very, very acute crisis. So I'd like your, thoughts about where do you see higher education and particularly AUB? And what do you see as the way forward so that we don't lose these, as Maha said, pillars or lungs of the Lebanese, and I would say of the region itself. So, Fadlo, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Paul. So, you know, I think, without blaming anyone, you know, William Sloane Coffin, the longtime chaplain of Yale during the Vietnam War, said there are three kinds of patriots: two bad, one good. The bad are the uncritical lovers and the loveless critics. Good patriots carry on a lover's quarrel with their country. And that's what Lebanon is in general. It's a country of people carrying on this constant quarrel with their country. It's a lover's quarrel. They do love the country. But the underpinning of the good critic is this university. Let me be blunt. 63, almost 64% of all high impact citable research comes from this one university. There's no Arab or Western or Eastern European country that carries that much of its country's national scientific output. It's also produced more presidents, prime ministers, leaders, not just in the political sphere, but the economic sphere, than anything else. And if you add in Saint Joseph, going back to the writings of the wonderful Jihad Zain, and I'll get to the sector which I am also concerned about in the higher education, which is the newspapers, the free press, to pick up one of Maha's points. So he makes the point that 80% of the culture from this country can ultimately be derived from these two universities. I want to give credit to a third university, which is the Lebanese University. I would argue with these three, you've got 90% of the culture, but you have other important private institutions: Haigazian, great school for teachers; LAU, a new university, but a long history as a college, a women's college; Beirut Arab, et cetera. So you have this ecosphere of 12 private and public universities, of which AUB, it's true, carries the greatest scientific burden. It is the university. It's not just the best, still by some margin, the best private university in the Arab world. It's by a very, very large margin the best American university abroad, if you look at science and where we place our graduates. So having a scientific university, if you go back to the foundation of the National Science Foundation by Vannevar Bush, from that famous letter from President Roosevelt to him, you're talking about translating scientific knowledge from wartime to peacetime. And AUB competed very well with useful knowledge all the way through the Civil War. But it's like the tortoise and the hare. Lebanon had a lead over the other region because, let's not fool ourselves, it wasn't just because of the beautiful Mediterranean. I would argue more than anything, it was because of the presence of these two universities. If you look at the other Mediterranean countries, and I know Ishaq has alluded to this in some of his writings, and like Syria and others that should potentially have more resources, should have been ahead, what kept this university ahead was this very rich cultural and educational history. So the one thing, all of these brilliant men, who I don't consider patriots in the political sphere, including the current government, the one thing no previous government ever took for granted was higher education. Now, I'm going to be blunt here. This is the worst government in Lebanese history with regard to their understanding of and their care of higher education. Why? Because at a time when the sector is in danger, and AUB will survive, but there are 11 other institutions. My good friend, the president of the Beirut Arab University, said to the Council of Ministers that their university could survive perhaps one more year with this banking situation. AUB can survive longer because, contrary to urban legend, most of our resources are abroad. And we will figure out a way to pay our faculty increasingly over time. They would have to close that excellent university. That's one of the few really good quality universities in the country. And nothing. I have to say, I'm sorry, Mahat, as usual, you're more diplomatic than me. This government does not care about higher education. And if they don't care about higher education, they don't care about education, they don't care about the country. So what is the risk here? And it's not just this government. Going back to the analogy of the tortoise and the hare, time is flying, and it's not just financial risk, as Ishaq was saying. It's the risk of losing your treasure. What has Lebanon's treasure been? It's educated young and older people who make a meaningful contribution to the milieu, and the milieu became the world, and that knowledge and those resources are funneled back. I said it in the New York Times. I am more worried today about Lebanon structurally and in the long term by far than I was during the war. Because those of us who immigrated during the war, Maha, myself, you others, we always looked longingly back at the old country. Now I'm worried with this younger generation, they're not going to want to look back or even remember because of how badly they're being treated in their own country. So it's critical to be candid and say, this is a time to take extra special care of the young and the population and not be so pathetic that when the French foreign minister says, I'm gravely concerned about Lebanon, we asking for anyone in the Lebanese government to help us to help them, total silence here. That silence is damning. It means there's nobody awake to recognize how dangerous this moment is. For now, COVID-19 is shutting down travel, but as Maha said, the big risk is the loss of this tremendous treasure of educated, capable, real technocrats. I don't consider this a technocratic government. To bring confidence, you've got to be competent. And I haven't seen one shred of competence so far in 6 months. So this rich vein of people who returned or are connected, like this Haq from Rod and others, you need to let them believe that there is hope. And I believe there is hope. I believe Lebanon now will be forced to invest in its people because every other resource is almost gone. Now, the universities, and we will protect ourselves in spite of this government and other governments, we will have to start partnering with the private sector and others to create opportunities for a different economic equation. There is no alternative.
Thank you, Fadlo. I want to ask you, I mean, I'm here in Washington. It is the American University of Beirut. There's also the Lebanese American University of Beirut, LAU, which, as you say, young university, but has done exceptionally well as also. As when you look at AUB's rescue package, as it were, you know, putting the condition of the country and the government, what is the component that you look to the United States or the US government? What are the elements of the AUB rescue plan that you can share with us when you say AUB will survive and, you know, and hopefully thrive? What does that look like to you?
So, you know, from my perspective, there needs to be a component from the US government, a component from the Lebanese government, and a component from other investors, okay? And the other investors have to be this milieu, the Arab world. And that component has to be for us to continue as a research university, for the Lebanese American University, which is growing into a research university. That's a very painful voyage for any institution, but they've made good strides under the last two presidents. They'll make good strides under this president. It's not just lip service. It's not just 10, 20, $30 million. It's the confidence that we can count on a multi-year intervention. So talking from the American perspective, public diplomacy, or soft power as the Americans like to consider, and I don't consider this soft power. I consider this, this is contributing to world culture, to having others learn about American and Western culture, as well as Eastern culture that's here, and bringing people closer together, getting rid of the fear of the other. So a multi-year package that can be focused. I'm very grateful for the support of this administration, particularly State Department, USAID in particular, and MEPI especially, for their assistance. But we're in discussions with them and others about what could a multi-year package look like and what do you want to invest in? So far, what we're hearing from the US is we want to invest in students, in outstanding students who can't pay tuition, but want to go forward to make a difference, okay? And to really capture American culture, but not necessarily be converted to American policy, which we don't do here at AUB. There are other American schools that do that. We don't do that. From the Lebanese government, we'd really, really like to urge them, and I've had meetings before, is at least give us a schedule of payments. I don't want to make us laugh. Give us a schedule of payments for the more than $150 million you owe us in medical bills. I mean, come on. Any creditor can do this. and just tell us if it's going to be in kind. What's the support going to be? Just talk to us. For the Arab world, I still think there are deep wells of respect, appreciation, and an interest in investing in this university. I think they would be interested in investing in this university if everyone would promise to take their hands off it politically, including the government here, the governments abroad, and allow us to continue to enrich young minds. That's my belief. I don't think this university would ever move forward were it to impart a particular political vein, but I think it can interact to help expand what Maha called this, and I'm going to use my own words, this vanishing culture of openness that we see in the Arab world. And that alone is a huge asset. And I'm going to wrap it up with this, Paul. When I was on Capitol Hill last year and the year before, I made the case with, I think, reasonably decent metrics that this university, were the United States to establish a world-class university today in the Arab world, you would still base it in Beirut, which is the most open city in the world. Of course, this argument was over 4 years. Haven't been there this year, but I will go there. And it would probably cost it upwards of $10 billion. I think if we could get assistance in the $100 to $150 million a year composite, we can more than make the rest of the assistance and continue to teach more than half of our students with almost complete financial aid.
Yeah, thank you, Fadl. I always sort of weep when I look at the hundreds of billions, indeed trillions, that are spent by the US in the Middle East on war, and then the nickel and dime bargaining with universities like AUB or LAU on $500,000, $1 million, $5 million. I mean, the mindset of investing in people and in education rather than in war, I mean, that's a whole nother discussion. But thank you.
To be fair, they have stepped up their assistance, but I think that's a good start. We need to show that we deserve a lot more, not just from the US, but elsewhere.
Absolutely. Thanks, Fadlo. I'm going to take some questions from the audience here and shoot a couple back to Sha. So a couple of people are asking particularly about the banking sector. Two kind of part question. What is the end game for banks? What are they trying to do? Where do they see their best case scenario for weathering this crisis and coming out of it in a way that pleases them, the bank owners? And another part of the question from another person, you said bank restructuring. What does that mean? How do you do it? And what does it mean for depositors?
Banks take deposits and then lend this money. There's about $120 billion of deposits in Lebanon. It's very large. It's like 4 times GDP now, one of the largest of the world, because this was the pump of wealth in the country, bringing money from abroad and then lending it mostly to the government. 70 to 80% of those funds are lent to the government. The government is bankrupt, has stopped paying on its debt. It's engaged in an operation of debt reduction. Those debts will be cut in half, more or less. It creates a big hole in the banks. Now, bank capital is about $20 billion. And so those losses, which are estimated in the government plan for the banks at about $60 billion, is huge for the country of the scale of Lebanon. They have to be largely divided, these losses, between bank owners, $20 billion, and bank depositors. That's what the initial government plan said. As long as this hole is there, people won't trust banks. If they reopen their doors, people would run to take out their deposits. There is an ongoing bank run. And so banks are frozen right now. They don't allow people to withdraw their money, and they can't serve any role in the economy. To bring them back to life, you have to clean up their balance sheet so that they are not bankrupt anymore. And to do that, they have to take losses, and these losses have to be distributed. What is blocking a resolution right now is that bank owners have counteracted to the government proposal and said, no, bail us out, give us your assets, give us government assets, give us the gold, give us all the energy and telecom and even land in front of the sea, and give us all your assets valued at $30 to $50 billion, and then we'll be fine. the crisis was not caused by us, it was caused by this inefficient government. So this is the counter proposal, and that's their way, what they're proposing as the way out. And so we're stuck now in this negotiating game between the street, the political elites, and the economic elites.
Well, when you say a bank restructuring, let me ask a bit more about that. I would imagine there's an investment side to it, bringing in new capital. You talked about, deciding and sharing the losses between owners and depositors. I imagine in other countries you try to bring in capital, and I imagine, but these are all questions, that you need to merge, consolidate and merge banks. Do you see, what are the elements of such a thing from other countries that have gone through this?
Yeah. No, that's exactly what you said. There's typically a bank organization group that is led by the central bank and by the government that evaluates bank by bank their ability to survive, that takes first the capital and then sees how much losses remain to be distributed and bail in depositors, starting typically with large depositors. Then you need to recapitalize the banks, but the banking system would be much smaller. It would shrink from 120 to whatever, 50, 60 billion dollars. So you'd need $5, $6, $7 billion of fresh money to recapitalize it, correct? And this could be part of an IMF financing arrangement.
Thank you.
Also, the central bank is very much in the middle of all the problems. It was kind of the agent that got the banks together so that they lent to the government. It was the pump making the whole system works. So it's difficult now to see the central bank in its current organization be the lead in this operation. Mm-hmm. The main reason the Lebanon needs the IMF is partly the liquidity, but mostly technical skills and this impartiality, which would allow such big reorganizations to happen and to happen quickly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Maha. Let me turn to you and a number of questions also from the audience. A number of questions on Hezbollah, the speech of Hassan Nasrallah yesterday or a couple of days ago. To what, how do you see Hezbollah as one of the, big forces in the country? They're organized in many ways. Where do you think, how do you read their read of the situation, their interests, where they're trying to get to, how they position themselves in all of this? Some people fear that, this is, some kind of opportunity for them to take over more than they are, or they are, having problems like others. What do you see Hezbollah's strategy, cost-benefit analysis? And another set of questions on something you did allude to, which is the army and the internal security forces, which is the backbone of the state, which is also what keeps the country from really complete state failure and sort of entering into complete chaos and militias and something similar to 1975. If you could say a bit more about your thoughts about the army and the ISF, what does it mean that, what will it mean, do you think, as their salaries dwindle to nothing? In particular, are they an organization that might put pressure or make a move? Obviously, in other Arab countries, the army has done that. In Lebanon, it's very difficult. But that question does arise. What are they likely to do? What pressure are they likely to bring to bear? So, Maha, to you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. I'll begin with the Hezbollah one. I think I'm not of the mind that Hezbollah is actually happy with this and they want to push the country to collapse. Far from it. I think Hezbollah is keen and interested in a stable backyard, in a stable Lebanon. And I think today they're caught between a kind of a rock and a hard place, if you want. They're backing the current government. They recognize the speed at which the social collapse, not just the economic collapse, but the social collapse is happening. Today, we're looking at a country where its talent and educated are leaving, but those that are remaining are becoming increasingly impoverished. We're talking about 50 to 60% poverty rates. Already, there's a lot of, and this is again one of the silver linings of this country, the tremendous support that has come from the grassroots, from civil society organizations for people, but it's not sustainable. And Hezbollah is aware of this. This idea of plant your garden, you know, all of these initiatives, they're great, it's self-sustainability to some extent, but none of this is long-term. These are short stopgap measures. Some of them are very populist, and Hezbollah is fully aware of this. They know that they will not be able to take care even of their own constituents in the short term. They can do it for months, but not for years, let alone for a broader populace. And I don't think Hezbollah wants to see that kind of complete collapse. But today, like all the other political parties, it's stuck at an impasse. All the political parties recognize that we've talked about burden sharing amongst banks and depositors and etc., but we're not talking about burden sharing between the political parties. And I think this is where as Hal was alluding to earlier, this is a political decision. The political parties, until now, the leadership has not recognized that it also has to lose some of the privileges that it has acquired through clientelist and nepotistic networks over the past 3-4 decades. This means letting go of things like the electricity, like the different defunct post-war institutions, like. I mean, we won't go into that. It's this burden sharing between them over the losses and what they're willing to give up where the impasse is. And Hezbollah's here trying to manage between its different allies. The question is, if push comes to shove, will it be forced to choose one ally over the other? That's not very clear. Will it be willing to dump one ally over the other? That's not very clear. So I think bottom line is they're not interested in a country collapsing. They don't need it to. And in fact, it will create more problems for them than needed. Now, on the army, I think it's very hard to really talk about the army in terms of what does that mean for the army. I mean, these are, at the end of the day, these are Lebanese citizens like everyone else. They've been out on the streets for the past since October, for the past 8 months now. The army and the ISF. They are institutionalized, but as we all know, there's also a lot of politicization of the security sector, perhaps in the ISF more than in the army itself. So at what point, again, will there be a tipping point? What kind of pressure tactics can they bring to bear? It's very difficult to until now, they've been towing the line. They've been doing their best in terms of continuing to support. But there is a moment when, if they're barely making ends meet, the question, and I'm hearing this already, is, why would I put myself in the line of fire or be asked to, hold back and get injured as I'm trying to contain increasingly violent, and we haven't talked about this, increasingly violent demonstrations, or just so I can make $200 or $300 or $400 or $500, whatever it is now, a month. In the absence of social protection mechanisms, and the absence of all of the things, and at a time when the system itself, Fadlo probably can talk a lot more about the crisis in the health sector today, which is significant. Hospitals are facing a very important crisis. So it's not clear. It's very difficult to give a time on this. I also want to respond to one question, if you'll allow me, which is on the Caesar Act. I saw it in the list that was put very quickly. I think the Caesar Act, there's a stick and carrot option. Obviously, the Caesar Act is a stick option of saying, all the talk about normalization with Syria, which was happening up till a few months ago by different political parties, not necessarily just Hezbollah, but by the FNP and others. All of that now has come to a complete stop. Any talk about importing fuel from Iran is also gone. So the options of breaking some of these taboos is gone. It's the carrot. The stick is obviously go and do your deal with the IMF, undertake the reforms. And if you do that, we will come in with a lot more support to help the country with the kind of actual financial support that is needed. I think the Caesar Act, we have not yet seen the ripple effects. I think there are a lot of, for example, businessmen were getting ready, both Lebanese and non-Lebanese. I know a lot of businessmen from the Gulf had come to Lebanon and set up their companies here in preparation for undertaking reconstruction activities in Syria. All of this now is coming to a complete stop. And we have to wait and see how this develops.
Thank you. Maha, yeah, I mean, I wanted to ask Dr. Khouri the question that you just alluded to about the health sector, and Fadlo, to lean on you as a medical professional, your long career there. Also, obviously, AUB has a very large medical center, as does St. Joseph, as you mentioned. LAU has a medical center, so the universities and the hospitals are interconnected. But also the Lebanese Hospital Association recently announced that they might be closing down too, and we're in the middle of a global pandemic that we haven't seen for a century. As a medical professional and a leader of a medical institution in Lebanon, looking at the other ones, how do you see the depth of the crisis of private hospitals? What is the role of public hospitals? How are the Lebanese going to be facing this pandemic, as well as their regular health needs, if this sector collapses like other sectors are doing?
I mean, I think it's challenging because this is a very, very now resource challenged country. Okay, so I've criticized the government. I will say that at least in the initial few months of the COVID-19 crisis, in some ways they did do a good job with limited resources. They didn't nearly get to the amount of testing they needed, but they managed to at least get the message out for people to stay at home. And part of that is helped by the fact that this is a very, very close-knit group of clans, as someone once wrote, right? So once you'd have an infection in a village, that village would close on itself. So that helped. And there was some cooperation, particularly between the private hospitals on one end and the public hospital, the Hariri Hospital on the other end. What did that do is that it prevented the flooding of ICUs, the oversaturation of ICU beds that we're seeing now so tragically in cities in the US. The last few weeks, we've had evidence that people are exhausted. Both the physicians and nurses who take care of patients and the population is not being as cautious, and the rates of COVID-19 are going up. Plus, this is a sector that, like us, maybe not as much as us, has not been paid for some time. So the challenge here, and I do have some empathy for the government on this one, is where do you put your limited resources? Is it in higher education? Is it in feeding people? Is it in hospitals? And as a physician, I would argue that health always gets the top priority along with education. That's my bias, and those are the businesses I'm in. My concern is there isn't a serious accounting of where those resources need to go. So Lebanon is oversaturated with medical professionals, particularly doctors, has a lot of hospitals, but if you look at the number of ICU beds the country has, it's not all that high. It's not bad, but it's not all that high. So this country could tip over quickly, both economically and from the perspective of the virus, if we're not careful. The last couple of weeks, seeing scenes of people in crowds and at restaurants, and Maha was suggesting there's a strong possibility that when people are hungry, they're going to go to the streets with increasing violence, is very alarming for me, because the health sector fared quite well. The hospitals during the first few months of Thawda in caring for the people who were wounded, even there, that government, previous government, failed to step up because they decided not to cover any trauma, right? Which is mind-boggling. You would think in a state of national emergency, the first thing they would do is to cover people injured in Thawda. They decided to turn their back on coverage there, so the hospitals were left to their devices. To get to the bottom line, that is one of the resources that this country has, which is good medical standards. And You're seeing for example, before this started, if you look at the numbers from 2017, 2018, median lifespan in Lebanon has shot up since the end of the civil war. That's been one of the success stories of this country. You've got some young people, you've got some older people, but people look after one another, and there's quality medicine and health. That is also at risk here, Paul. And the concern here is, first you lose good people, then the standards start to slip, and then you have a scenario where another precious asset is lost. All of this is to say is I think the country needs, and Ishaq led with it needs a national restructuring plan, not just an economic plan, and restructuring education. Why did I criticize the government in the education sector? Because they prioritize for-profit education with their actions, not their words, over the not-for-profits. Those are the university branches they opened up while ignoring the Lebanese university and the not-for-profits. With regard to the hospital system, there's been better cooperation with the government, not financial, but otherwise. But I do become very concerned when I don't see a comprehensive plan of where we're going with this. And this is one, with all respect to Maha and Ishaq, these little boys and girls are going to have to get together, come up with a plan, because if Lebanon gets hit with a major COVID-19 wave, it is going to be catastrophic. This country will be overwhelmed within less than 15 to 20 days. And then you've got every type of disaster in the same way. In the long run, I am optimistic. I do see quite a few capable people who can pull it together. But going back to the tortoise and the hare, time is running out here. We all need to get our act together, all of us. We can do it, but we have to get our act together.
Thank you, Fadlu. We're almost out of time, but I do want to throw in a question to Ishaq that a number have been asking about. And this is, we've talked about the government, we've talked about the banks. Obviously, the central bank is a central player in all of this. And Ishaq, when you look at other countries and as part of the strategy, what is it that the central bank has to do to help turn this around or to build a new foundation?
Look, I think this is my last intervention, so I'll answer this and a short conclusion. The central bank is not playing its role right now. The monetary policy needs to be coordinated with fiscal policy and be extremely tight right now, so that we stop this hyperinflation spiral in which we're in. Instead, the central bank is just printing liras in order to reduce dollar deposits and save itself out of this crisis. And so the central bank needs to be reined in like the rest of the institutions. I want to end with a sense of urgency, really. We are in a situation that's absolutely dramatic economically. I mean, I talked of cardiac arrest moving into septic shock, and it's real. We have 50% of inflation a month. I mean, this is the largest collapse in relative terms that ever happened. It's going to become a case study, unfortunately, in textbooks around the world. This is worse than the Venezuela situation. The economy is literally disappearing, and this is potentially gonna lead to famine. I mean, the situation is absolutely, and to make things worse, the political system is totally unable to deal with it. If I may, put it in my terms, we have a sectarian system, a power sharing system that has 3 vetoes now in a very divided region, so that 3 very different parts, different oligarchs have to agree even on a color of a wall, and they will never be able to implement any of the policies that are needed right now. The system is completely in an impasse. It will have to find its way out, implode or change gradually, whatever. But I think to conclude, I want to say that the role of international actors is going to be very important here. This is not the time to bail out this regime. It's very important to stick to conditionality, to force the IMF in, because it's going to be the only adult in the room, really. And in the meanwhile, to help the private sector, to help universities, to help find ways to help the private sector, civil societies, but really stick to not bailing out this regime and allow the dynamic political process in the country to take advantage of this crisis to move out of this impasse and put together a political system with all the good Lebanese that exist, with all their skills to really rebuild their country and be able to work in it and be productive and creative in it rather than be forced to migrate out in order to live their lives.
Thank you, Sha. And maybe that's a good point to end, to underline the urgency and the enormity of the crisis, but to also say that it's, it requires urgent action. It's also an opportunity to rebuild, to restructure, to build something different than what was built after the Civil War ended in 1990 and led us to where we are today. And that obviously the main responsibility is on Lebanese, civil society, leadership, parties, and everything, but also that there is a role for the international community and international institutions within sort of the proper framework, as you indicated. I want to thank you all. Dr. Ishaq Diwan, thank you for joining us from Paris. Dr. Maha Yahya from Beirut, thanks Maha for being with us. And Dr. Fadlu Khouri, good luck at AUB, good luck in Beirut. And thank you all who joined us on Zoom and who joined watching on the live stream for being with us today. Hope to see you again. Thank you very much.